Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, uh, and welcome to our online panel discussion on photography as resistance during the Holocaust. We're very pleased to have you all with us, wherever you are in the world. So I know I'm speaking to you from the UK. We have some of our panelists are from Europe, some from the United States, and it's just wonderful to have all of you with us. My name is Tracy Peterson. I lead the Holocaust in the United Nations Outreach Programme. And the program was established by the member states of the United Nations. It's placed in the Department of Global Communications. Before we begin, just a few housekeeping notes. The discussion is being recorded, and we will share the recording in the next few days that follow. And we will have time after the panelists have spoken for your questions to be shared with the panelists. So please you can start writing in your Q&A as soon as you are ready in the Q&A section, any questions you may have. So everybody, today is the International Day for Countering Hate Speech. And we know, don't we, how much words matter. We see every day how words can be used to encourage hatred. When we look to the past, we realize very quickly that the world is a long and painful history of language being used by humans to facilitate human rights abuses, and a history of harnessing technology to facilitate the spread of hateful words and speech. We learn also that silencing is an effective means of spreading hate speech too. The Nazi government dismantled the free press in Weimar Germany, burned books, and used control of the media to devastating effect. With such overwhelming evidence, it's hard not to lose sight of the people targeted by the hate speech. It is hard to remember and to see resistance by the victims of the dehumanization of the Nazis and their racist collaborators. But resistance there was, even in the face of grave risk. Today, we turn our attention to the Jewish photographers, some amateur, some professional, who during the Holocaust resisted Nazi dehumanization through their photography. We acknowledge the extraordinary courage it took and the impact those actions have had on our understanding about the Holocaust. We have an expert panel, and it is my pleasure to welcome them. Ms. Janina Struck, Dr. Christoph Kreutzmüller, Professor Valerie Hebert, and Professor Daniel Magilo. We will open with our esteemed colleague, Mr. Ian Phillips, whom we are very pleased to have join us. Mr. Phillips is the Director of the United Nations News and Media Division of the Department of Global Communications. Before taking up his position as Director of News and Media at the United Nations, Mr. Phillips served as Vice President of International News for the Associated Press. Mr. Phillips brings with him a wealth of experience in the world of journalism and has worked across the world, including Buenos Aires, Paris, London, Prague, and Cairo. We are very pleased that Mr. Phillips is joining us today to deliver the opening remarks. Mr. Phillips, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Tracy, and hello, everybody. It's a real privilege to be here at such an important discussion of such an important topic. As Tracy said, I am relatively new to the UN and joined last year from the Associated Press, where for 3 decades I either was in the field or managed teams covering conflict and war. And I was reflecting on this call today and thinking that when I look back on my career, even though the reporting was so important, even in Tracy's words, as the words were important, what really stands out to me now looking back was the photography. Those are the moments that are really seared into my brain, the power of photography. Our photographers were a strong group. They won many Pulitzers between them, and they may not have been so pivotal in the sort of day-to-day news conversations, leading some to think that they were being ignored. But really, when you look back, you realize just how amazing their work was. They had that ability to capture the moment in a war, in a humanitarian situation, in a crisis. from 9/11, and the obvious example that springs to mind is the falling man picture, the man who was falling down from the towers, to war and conflict in Africa, Asia, to humanitarian crises, to migration. They were always on the scene and they were always waiting for that moment. Their work transcends time. I look back now at the photographs that were on the wall of the Pulitzer Prizes that they had won, and just realize that it stands the test of time. It's remembered forever, and helps you understand a tragedy or a much bigger issue in just one fleeting moment. There were such interesting conversations when I was in that company about the ethics of what we were doing. And I think that's particularly poignant for a conversation like today's. At what point are you telling a story, or at what point are you at risk of violating someone's privacy? And as we all know, that was particularly the case in the Holocaust. But if those, my view is that if it's not too gratuitous, and if it does help future generations understand the appalling nature of that particular moment, then there's fewer greater callings in journalism. There was an artistic brilliance to these people, there continues to be, but there was a real intellectual rigor about, am I going too far? Am I, should I stand back? Should I not publish these pictures? But more often than not, we would come to the conclusion that it was in the public interest. And I can't help but notice through history the amount of times there has been a conflict when photographers are not involved, and when the world isn't be able to see what happens. And you ask yourself, might photography have changed the course of history? Might it have just produced that one moment where world leaders come together and say, enough, this has to stop? In this era of awful, rampant misinformation and disinformation, I think photography is even more critical. And on a topic like the Holocaust, we all know, sadly, that somehow there are still Holocaust deniers. Well, the pictures help prove the point. As absurd as that might be, or it might seem, it's still really important to be able to point to those historical documents, both in the Holocaust, but other pogroms and other atrocities around the world, because it freezes time. The power of that photography to just put you back in that moment and once and for all just throw out any conjecture or denial. So that's it from me. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. Some great people on, and really looking forward to hearing your insights and your expertise on this important topic.
Thank you very much, Mr. Phillips, for immediately beginning our talk and raising these important points that you did about the impact that photography has, and making us consider what it means to be photographing at the time that the atrocity is happening, and what it means also to consider what it means to be a victim at the time that the atrocity is happening, taking the photographs. So thank you for that, for opening our discussion. And now I want to turn to Ms. Janina Struck. Ms. Struck is a documentary photographer, a teacher, lecturer, and writer. She's the author of the acclaimed book, Photographing the Holocaust, Interpretations of the Evidence, which presents a history and critique of images taken during the Holocaust, as well as the book, Private Pictures, Soldiers Inside View of the War. And I want to also flag her forthcoming book, Photography and Resistance, Securing the Evidence in Nazi-Occupied Europe. Welcome, Ms. Struck. We look forward to hearing from you.
Can you hear me?
We hear you very well.
Thank you. We've had a few technical problems. Thank you very much. Thank you, Tracy, for inviting me to join this panel and for the introduction. It's a privilege to take part. In my brief presentation, I'll introduce some of the different ways in which photography was used as a means of resistance, referring specifically to images taken clandestinely. But first, what do we mean by photography as resistance? In the context of the Second World War, the phrase might conjure up images of partisans wielding weapons in the forests of Eastern Europe. These type of images were indeed taken, including by the Jewish studio photographer Faye Schulman, who lived in a small town in present-day Belarus. When Schulman's family were incarcerated in the ghetto in 1942, she was spared by the Nazis. Her photographic skills were useful to them. But when they gave her a film to process that had on it images of a pit filled with the bodies of more than 1,000 ghetto inhabitants, including her own family, she knew her days were numbered. One night, she packed her camera, put on her coveted leopard skin coat, and went to join the partisans in the forest, where she stayed until the end of the war. This is a photograph of Faye Schulman on the right-hand side. Schulman regarded her photographs as both acts of resistance and evidence of resistance. I wanted people to know there was a resistance, she said. Jews did not go like lambs to the slaughter. I was a photographer. I have pictures. I have proof. Her story is remarkable, but to hundreds or perhaps even thousands of other individuals, the use of photography as a form of resistance against the Nazis meant something profound. Some took pictures as a form of civil or personal resistance, while others were part of an underground resistance whose aims were to smuggle the images to the Allied countries. The hope was that they would influence public opinion and the government's approach to the war. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. This picture shows an execution in the market square in the Polish town of Drohobych, which is now in Ukraine. It's taken between 1941 and 1944. When I first saw this picture, I wondered what had emboldened the photographer to run that lethal risk. Was it taken to pass to an underground organisation as evidence of Nazi crimes? Or maybe so that future generations might know what happened that day in Drohobych? Or perhaps the photograph was taken as a refusal to stand by as a passive observer. Taking a photograph is an intervention in an event. What we can be sure of is that the person behind the camera, if caught, would also have faced execution. In Nazi-occupied Europe, photography was a dangerous business and remained an underground activity. 2 decades after first seeing this picture, I was able to establish who the photographer was. Adam Paszulka took the picture from his window. He took it reportedly due to a hatred of fascism and a desire for revenge and freedom. In the Holocaust archives, there are many clandestine images taken from hiding places. They were taken from behind a window, a partially opened door, a crack in the wall, objects that appear in the frame as dark, ominous shapes that convey a sense of danger and of urgency. What was it about photographs that made so many people risk their lives to take or secure them? It was a question that fascinated me. Could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. The picture on the cover of my book, to be published in the autumn, was taken in 1942 in Poland. It was one of a series of clandestine images taken by an underground activist. It shows a column of Jewish men, women and children carrying bundles and bags during the deportations from a ghetto to the death camps. It appears the camera was hidden behind an outer garment. The ragged edge of the fabric had created a kind of vignette, a peephole effect. It tells us we're looking at something we're not supposed to see. Could I have the next slide, please? The best-known clandestine images were taken at Auschwitz-Birkenau by the Sonderkommando. That's the Jewish prisoners put to work burning the bodies of those murdered. The images were taken in August 1944 from inside a crematorium, when the gassing of the Jews was at its peak. In this period, more than 430,000 Hungarian Jews were murdered. The image shows bodies of those gassed being burned on a pyre. The film was passed to the camp's underground network and the image smuggled to nearby Krakow in a desperate attempt to inform the world of these unimaginable crimes. Few believed the reports, but it was hoped that everyone would believe the pictures. In Nazi-occupied Poland, there was no governmental collaboration with the Nazis. Instead, the Poles created an underground state and a sophisticated two-way communications channel through which photographs were smuggled to London. In this digital age of media, when multiple images can be transmitted around the world in seconds, it's important to realise that in this period we're talking about film photography, and the only safe way to smuggle photographs and documents was to copy them onto celluloid film. When the films were processed, they were stuffed inside a variety of ingeniously adapted objects, a pen, a cigarette lighter, or maybe the heel of a shoe. And they were carried by hundreds of couriers, of men and women who risked their lives to cross heavily guarded borders so that evidence might reach the Allied countries. Images taken by Nazis and German soldiers who were obsessed by documenting their crimes were also valuable evidence to the underground. The difficulty was trying to get hold of them. I met a photo worker in Warsaw who was part of a secret network in a local photo shop. Jerzy Tomaszewski made copies of the perpetrator's incriminating photographs. Other images were smuggled from photographic departments of concentration camps, including from Mauthausen. A young prisoner, a Spanish Republican photographer called Francisco Bois, was involved in a clandestine smuggling operation that would save thousands of incriminating images taken by SS photographers. Bois would survive and testify at the Nuremberg trials. The images were used as evidence. In the Jewish ghettos, a different kind of a resistance emerged. In the Warsaw Ghetto, Jewish historian and activist Emanuel Ringelblum, who saw the role of the historian as a fighter in the national struggle, established a secret archive that included photographs, diaries, reports, and testimonies. To Ringelblum, the archive was an act of civil and cultural resistance. Ringelblum was shot dead by the Nazis, but part of the archive, which was buried in the ghetto, did survive. Could I have the next slide, please? In the ghetto in Łódź, the second largest ghetto to Warsaw, the professional photographers Henryk Ross and Mendel Grossman also buried their photographs. They spent 4 years documenting ghetto life appointed by the Judenrat, that is the Jewish administration that carried out German orders. They also took clandestine images, and like Ringelblum, they saw their work as evidence that would eventually be used to bring the perpetrators to justice. Around 3,000 of Ross's photographs survived, and he was able to use them as evidence in the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem in 1961. This image, taken secretly from inside a cupboard, shows Jews being deported from the ghetto to Auschwitz-Birkenau. The conviction of all those who used photography, whether for urgent propaganda use or for future testimony, was that their photographs would count as vital evidence. What these histories tell us is just how important it is to know the stories behind the pictures, who took them and why they took them, information that is crucial to how we interpret and understand the images. And I'll finish there. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so very much, Ms. Strook. You've given us such a rich input there, and we thank you so much for being able to name some of the people you can, and also just pointing to us that there were the photographers, there was a whole network of resistance in order to get the images out if they could. And I'm sure there are going to be lots of questions, and we'll come back to you. But I want to turn now to historian, curator, and educator, Dr. Christoph Kreutzmüller. Dr. Christoph Kreutzmüller is the co-director of the Last Scene, Pictures of Nazi Deportations project, which is at the Selma Stern Center for Jewish Studies in Berlin-Brandenburg. He also serves on the advisory board for Exhibiting Nazi War Crimes and the Holocaust in Immediate Post-War Europe at the German Historical Museum, and serves as a member of the European Holocaust Research Infrastructure or ERI expert group on Holocaust photography. Prior to this, Dr. Kreutzmüller was a senior historian and curator at the Memorial House of the Wannsee Conference, an advisor and guide of the Berlin seminar Truth, Justice and Remembrance at the Robert Bosch Foundation, curator of the permanent exhibition at the Jewish Museum Berlin, and senior researcher at the Humboldt University of Berlin. Dr. Kreutzmüller holds a PhD in history from the Humboldt University of Berlin. Dr. Kreutzmüller, we're very pleased to have you. Over to you.
Thank you very much indeed for the kind introduction, and thank you. I'm really honored to be here, and I would kindly ask for the PowerPoint to be started so I can see it. And because what I would like to do is kind of take us half a step back, and that is to the beginning of the persecution, like the years 33 onwards, because I think this is really a vital time, especially in the light of the political developments we are seeing, we have to witness now. I think it's important to see how segregation policies start. Next slide, please. And what I would like, and the next one, I thought I could skip that. What I would really like to do is talk about perspectives. And sorry, I'll start with the Nazi photograph. That's the last one I'm going to show. I'm not going to do it again, I promise. But it's just to highlight a few things. One is usually Nazis put themselves into the middle of the picture. They want to show that they are in control, like in this photograph taken by Fritz Steppun of the so-called boycott, which as a matter of fact was blockade the day before it actually happened, in order to have a picture ready waiting to be published. And so you can see these young SA men disciplined. They're holding a propaganda message in the form of the poster, which is bilingual. And I think that's very typical. So it's if the perpetrator photography often has got the perpetrators in the middle, a center of the attention, and they often have propaganda messages. Janina Struck wrote a lot on that. If you compare that to the next photo, Bo, would you please take us on? This is a photograph taken of the same thing, so to speak, the blockade of the businesses that the Nazis thought to be Jewish or owned to be by Jews. And this is a young woman taking a photograph of the pickets, an SA man and SS man, in front of her father's notary office. And they were living on the other side of the street, so she's taking this photo in order to document. But you can see, and she wrote that later on, that she is really afraid. And kind of you can measure the fear in the distance to the perpetrators, to the SA man. Because it would have been very, very difficult, if not very dangerous, to go there with a camera at hand and really shoot them and say, smile, please, you know, that. So that was not on. So you can see the distance, and the distance describes the danger in that. Next slide, please. And of course, lots of photographs were taken as documentations. Lots of them were taken in family albums at the same time. So you get this parallel thing that in photograph album of Jewish families, every now and then you get a photograph of persecution, but of course you see families being happy. In 1933, 34, 35, you see people going, you don't know where. So it's all there in these albums. And I would like to take you through one series now. Next slide, please. And that was taken by Fritz Fürstenberg. Fritz Fürstenberg was a Berlin Jew who opened a new business in Amsterdam, and he took his car on frequent rides between Amsterdam and Berlin, those 650 kilometers. And on one occasion, that's August 1935, he took photographs of all the signposts against Jews, prohibiting or whatever, stating Jews are forbidden here in our village. And I would like to show you a few of those signposts, of photographs of the signpost. Next slide, please. So one is, it's written in German Gothic writing, and it's in the form of limerick. Next slide, please. Is a signpost where people can't even spell. They can't spell, like nichts in German doesn't have an apostrophe. So what you clearly can see, it's not just the illiteracy of the Nazis, but that's the locals. It's not top down, it's bottom up, so to speak. The locals putting up those signposts. And of course, in so doing, they are asking the state, they're asking the regime to finally define who are the Jews, because in the summer of 35, there was no definition as yet. Next slide. And what you can clearly see, and that's what he took photographs of, is there's different forms of violence. In top left, it's a fairly, how would I put it? Maybe it's in a way, it's rather neutral. They say, look, we don't wish the Jews to be here. Bottom right is, if you talk to Jews, you are excluded out of our community. So one is a warning against the Jew, the other is a warning against the non-Jews. And the middle bit is of course, is really horrible, because it says Jews enter this village on their own risk, So this is really offering or acting violently. And you can see the violence in the photograph because you can see the ornament of the hood of the car. So in that you can see that this photograph was taken out of the car. Of course, Fritz Fürstenberg was afraid in taking the photographs. Who wouldn't have been? Because, like, had anyone seen him in this little village, he would have been beaten up horribly, and he would have lost his camera, maybe concentration camp. That's not yet clear. It's 35. Next slide, please. This is a photograph taken by Fürstenberg, and now what you can see to the right is the way the Central Jewish Information Office presented it, because the Central Jewish Information Office in Amsterdam made a lantern slide presentation. So basically what I'm doing now, and I'm quoting now, and I think the quote is important, on the German refugee problem in October 35. In the Netherlands, there was a huge discussion on the refugees, i.e. the German Jews coming, and they tried to describe why they were coming. And this is how they did it. And the Central Jewish Information Office, which then became the Wiener Library, protected their sources and whitened the face of the woman, fiancée of Fritz Fürstenberg, and told everyone the photos were not done by a Berlin Jew, but were done by a Dutch motorcyclist. And the photographs of Dutch motorcyclists are well known now. People, really tend to believe in this context information. And it's a lot of research in order to find out, oh, the Dutch motorcyclist was actually a German driver of a sedan Packard. Next slide, please. And of course, taking photographs is a difficult matter in the face of violence. And I'm showing this photograph because it's taken by Georg Simon, born in Chemnitz, raised in Chemnitz. His father worked in the synagogue, and before emigrating, he wanted to take a photograph of the destroyed synagogue after the pogrom some people still refer to as Kristallnacht. And of course, he just couldn't stand there and take a photograph. So what he did is he got himself on his bicycle, got the camera ready, cycled past and took one photograph. So you can see of the ruin, of course. And that's why it's a bit tilted and, of course, a bit blurred. He didn't have that time. Like the perpetrators usually had all the time in the world to take a photo, develop the photograph, and all that. And the persecutor often didn't have that time. And many, of course, photographs were then destroyed by the perpetrators. Like, how many photographs were taken to Auschwitz and then burned by the Nazis? We don't know. It's millions. So it's what we see is really just a tiny fraction, really. Last photograph, please. And this is because, like, us historians, we usually tell people like we know everything, which is, of course, fairly stupid. And this is a photograph I'm just dealing with, basically, for the project Last Scene. It's in Yad Vashem, and we don't know anything about it. We don't know the photographer, we don't really know the place. Like, from having looked at photographs of deportations for 2.5 years now, I know this is deportation luggage. This is how it looked like. And you can see on the jacket of the man this traces of the yellow star of the racist marking, just on the breast pocket. You can see a bit. So what I would think is what happens is that it's imminent deportation of him, that man, or that man and the woman, we don't know. And they asked someone to come and take a last photograph as a farewell, maybe a greeting to their children. We don't really know. And it will be very, very difficult to reconstruct. And I'm just putting and highlighting this in order to say, look, there are so many sources which we haven't deciphered yet, where we really need to know the context. And that's work we really have to do in order to understand these photographs. It would be really wonderful to know a bit more. And Janina, I know from talking to her, has at times worked for 20 years to find this one clue. That's something we still have to do. And of course, in the light of artificial intelligence coming and producing photograph, like pictures that looks like photograph, we really have to be fast about it, because at a certain point we will have to close down the archives because we can't ascertain anymore which is which, fake or real photograph. And very last one, even in Perpetrator photograph, you can find resistance. And that is from the Lily Jakob album, the so-called Auschwitz album. It's the 4 females who stick their tongue out to the photographer. That's something my colleagues Stefan Hörtler, Tal Brückmann, and I found in working with that album for 6.5 years, and we dedicated our book to them, because I think, like in the face of these SS men taking your picture, that what can you do in these circumstances surrounding you in Auschwitz? Yeah, that's one of the things you can, and they did, and I think that's fairly brave. And of course, it's women. So maybe we ought to discuss women and resistance, but that's a different matter. And I have to close now because it's 8 minutes.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kreutzmüller. We could very easily, I'm sure, carry on listening to you for quite a while, but we will come back to you. Thank you for pointing a couple of things to us to think about how important photography as a form of documenting a growing abuse of human rights, how important that is, as you took us into from 33 to 39, showing us the closing down. You also raised the specter, or possibly, let's rephrase it more positively, the question of how do we work as historians with AI? AI is a problem, but can it also be harnessed in a different way? Let us go on to our next panelist, who is Professor Valérie Herbert. She is the Professor of History and Interdisciplinary Studies at Lakehead University, Orillia, in Ontario. Professor Herbert teaches on modern European history, Nazi Germany, the Holocaust, and the photography of human rights violations and international conflict. She has won fellowships from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, Hebrew University, and the Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. She's published on the Nuremberg trials, Rwanda's Gacaca tribunals, the German resistance figure Kurt Gerstein, and Holocaust photography. Her edited collection on the Skader Beach execution photographs, entitled Framing the Holocaust, Photographs of a Mass Shooting in Latvia, was published in 2023. She is currently working on an SSHRC Inside grant-funded monograph, 5 shots from Sodol Bonov, Photographs of the Holocaust by Bullets, 1942, and is also editing a special issue of Holocaust and Genocide Studies on Holocaust photography. And so it is our pleasure to have you on the panel, Professor Herbert, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Tracy, and thank you also for the invitation to be part of this conversation. It's my honor to be part of it. As Janina and Christoph have just described, victims and members of the victim community often took images, even explicit images, that recorded their persecution, their humiliation, and the violation of their bodies in order to create a record, to ensure memory, to prompt intervention. They understood that photographs are uncannily persuasive, more compelling even than eyewitness testimony, because the receiver of that information sees it with their own eyes. In having such images, the viewer can speak to the truths to which these images testify. And because these photographs were made in order to document and expose crime, we also understand their value as tools of resistance, indeed as necessary tools of resistance. But I'd like to widen our focus to consider photographs taken by perpetrators and connect them to our theme of resistance photography. In perpetrator images, we also see persecution, humiliation, violation. The difference is that these photographs were made to celebrate these things. They exist because of the photographer's power, domination, and ideological commitments. And this is where an ethical problem arises, because in viewing, publishing, and exhibiting perpetrator images, we risk extending those hateful impulses into the present moment. Well, may I have the first slide, please? So I recently published a collection of essays about a series of photographs. Could you go back one slide, please, Bo? And these images document a mass shooting that took place in December 1941 on the beach at Škėda near the port city of Liepaja in Latvia. And there, German police and their Latvian collaborators murdered 2,749 Jews, mainly women and children. And I'd like to add Dan Magalo, my co-panelist today, contributed to this volume. One of the German shooters that day, we don't know precisely who, they've been linked to 4 men, but one of the German shooters took 12 photographs on the first day of this 3-day shooting action. His pictures chronicle the sequential steps of the massacre. We see people, groups of people who have been brought to a holding area at the beach. We see people undressing. We see smaller groups being walked to the shooting site. We see them lined up facing the sea, their backs to the gunmen with a mass grave separating them. We see bodies lying dead. Next slide, please, Bo. This photograph is the best known of the series of 12. It appears frequently and often by itself in books, museum exhibits, documentaries, artworks about the Holocaust. From the time that this photograph was rediscovered in Soviet archives, it has acquired iconic status. It is used as shorthand to articulate and demonstrate Nazi barbarity, to represent the so-called Holocaust by bullets, to symbolize the utter vulnerability of the Jewish people under Nazi power. These readings of the image are not wrong. They are not a misrepresentation of or a misinterpretation of the visual information the photograph provides us, but it is only a partial understanding of what the photograph documents. Returning to the photograph's creation, although we know that one of the German shooters took this and the other 11 pictures, we don't know why. The images were discussed in a few post-war trials of men involved in the shooting. One witness testified that they were taken because there was a high-ranking military delegation present at the shooting to observe it, and thus it was a special occasion of sorts. Others claimed the photos were made to quote-unquote prove that Latvians were responsible for the shooting, because in every image where one sees men in uniform, those are the Latvian auxiliaries who were helping that day. However, 6 of the images, half of the series, focus on naked or partially clothed women, which suggests a personal, unofficial mandate. 4 of the photographs, a third of the series, capture children in moments of terror. This is one of those 4. This also seems to indicate another personal preoccupation. In 4 of the images, the subjects appear to be aware of the photographer. There's eye contact in at least 5. He was close enough that the subjects would have been aware of his presence, even if they didn't make eye contact with him. What these patterns tell us is that that day on the beach, the photographer's project was an additional act of cruelty separate from the task of mass murder. And all this to say that the camera was the other weapon deployed against the Jews that day. Taking their photograph was a degrading intrusion before their actual death. As Mariana Hirsch observes, the people were shot twice. And the geometry of any photograph means that when we view this image, we occupy the same position that the photographer once did. Do we reenact the dynamic that turned victims into spectacles when we look at it? Of the entire series, this photograph is the only one where we see someone trying to hide from the photographer. It's the little girl on the very left. Her name was Sorella Epstein. She was 10 years old. Her hunched shoulders, her bowed head remind us that while the photographer could compel her mother, her aunt, and 2 other women to cooperate with his handmade souvenir, he didn't have their consent. It is a pointed and painful reminder that we have, willingly or not, become accomplices in the photographer's ruthless enterprise. What therefore justifies our presence here? Why should we look at this and the other 11 photographs, given their sordid origins and the possibility of reanimating the original exploitative gaze? The arguments against looking spring from the concerns I've just signaled. These photographs were taken without consent. They were driven by a vicious impulse to further humiliate and defile their subjects. They preserve in perpetuity both the perpetrator's violent gaze and the victim's humiliation. They celebrate, they titillate, they shock, they numb, they teach us nothing worth knowing. Weighing in favor of continued engagement with these and similar images is that they individualize and personalize the otherwise abstract figure of 6 million. When we look at faces, when we restore names, which photographs have been a way to accomplish, we grasp at a deeper level the loss that this history represents. In this way, the photographs serve a memorial function. They undermine the Nazi goal to erase the memory of Jewish life in Europe and to destroy the evidence of that erasure. Connected with this, there is one more significant reason why I believe that we should consider the Shketa Beach photographs alongside victim resistance photography. We have this series of 12 photographs because David Zivkon, a Latvian Jewish man working for the German occupiers, discovered them. And at enormous risk to himself, smuggled out negatives, made copies, hid them, and then handed those prints over to Soviet liberators near the war's end. That is, he understood their evidentiary value and he risked his life to preserve it. Therefore, while one reading of these photographs perpetuates the cruelty that once defined them, another reading undermines that message and subverts the photographer's intentions. In this way, even perpetrator photography can be interpreted as on the side of the victim. To reiterate, this same photograph is both the means to celebrate violence and the means to remember and mourn those whom the violence claimed. The project of resistance extends to our present day against the hatreds on which the Holocaust was predicated and against the attempt to minimize or erase its memory. Photographs, even perpetrator photographs, are vital for this work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Herbert. You certainly have problematized and made us relook and rethink, I think, in very valuable ways. So thank you very much. We will return to you. I would like to turn now to our final panel member, whom you've already pointed out to us, and that's Professor Daniel Magilo. Professor Magilo is the Lindsay Young Professor of Germany at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, and the co-editor-in-chief of Holocaust and Genocide Studies. He serves as on the Academic Council of the Holocaust Education Foundation of Northwest University and the Academic Committee of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. His teaching and research center on photography and film and their intersections with Holocaust studies, Weimar Germany, and post-war memory. I am going to hand over to you now, Professor Magilo. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. I'm going to bravely try to share my screen here and wish me luck here. I presume you can see this?
We can indeed. It's perfect.
Great.
Thank you.
All right. Well, first and foremost, thank you so much for this invitation and this opportunity to talk about this important topic. In this brief presentation, I'm going to talk about iconic Holocaust photographs and the ways that they have shaped our perceptions of Jewish resistance. And so I have three goals with this presentation. First, to define in a little more detail what iconic photographs are, and specifically what secular icons are. And then after that, secondly, I'd like to discuss an iconic Holocaust photograph that is often perceived as, or often read as, or often used as a symbol of protest against Nazi violence, and to explain why this idea is problematic. And then third, and finally, I'm going to return to some of the images that Janina Struck showed us, specifically the Sonderkommando images, to compare these the iconic photograph that you'll instantly recognize with the Sonderkommando photographs, which I think are much less well known, but which are much more gestures of resistance, if perhaps less well known outside of specialist circles. So my point here is, I think one that among academics and specialists in this field is not a particularly new or profound one, but nevertheless, I think an important one, particularly in the context of an outreach program like this context, and that is that iconic photographs have profoundly affected the memory of the Holocaust and of Jewish resistance. And specifically, I would argue that they've contributed to a tendency to help make the Holocaust palatable to non-Jewish audiences by narrating this traumatic history as though it were a sort of Christian redemption story. So let me begin by defining two of these key terms, iconic photographs and secular icons. Iconic photographs are those instantly recognizable and widely circulated images that seem to distill complex histories into singular images. Some examples from World War II and the Holocaust include Joe Rosenthal's raising the flag on Iwo Jima, Yevgeny Khaldai's raising a flag over the Reichstag, Margaret Bourke-White's photographs of liberated prisoners at Buchenwald, Alfred Eisensted's VJ Day in Times Square, photographs of Anne Frank, and of course, there are many others. Iconic photographs can be frustrating to photo archivists because they are so frequently recycled and so frequently requested. So just as a sort of anecdotally, the photo archives at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum have tens of thousands of images that go unseen because when people are doing publications or need images that have a kind of public-facing dimension to them, they very often people want to see the same images and they're used over and over often, and they're often detached or kind of unmoored from their history. Some iconic images have become what the scholar Cornelia Brink terms secular icons. And as the term suggests, these are iconic photographs that have taken on quasi-religious dimensions. And that are invested not only with the power to serve as a historical shortcut, but as photographs that have a kind of metaphysical significance, a kind of greater truth to them, almost a religious truth. But often this comes at the cost of complexity and nuance. One of the best known of these secular icons is the famous photograph of the boy in the Warsaw Ghetto. If you do a reverse image search on Google, you see that this image shows up on thousands of websites. And I can guarantee you that not all of those websites are about the history of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. To the contrary, this photograph has become a stand-in for the entirety of the Holocaust across thousands of miles and across several years. And it's been invested with explanatory powers that it simply doesn't have. When we see the frightened boy with his hands in the air, but without any additional captioning, the Holocaust becomes a simple morality tale of good, innocent, childlike Jewish victims versus cold, heartless Nazis. The image takes on Christian overtones as a narrative of a child who is persecuted, such that we today might learn the importance of tolerance and peace. But in its original context, this photograph had very different meanings. That context was a bureaucratic document known as the Stroop Report. On April 19, 1943, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising began, and despite being at a huge disadvantage in terms of resources, the Jews of the Warsaw Ghetto fought courageously against superior German forces for several weeks and inflicted significant damage on them. Because so many German soldiers died, the lieutenant general who suppressed the uprising, Jürgen Strupp, needed to save face with his superiors in Berlin. And so to do so, he compiled a secret 125-page leather-bound report for his bosses as a kind of pre-digital PowerPoint presentation. And the Stroop report contains all sorts of facts and figures to demonstrate what a fine job he did, quote unquote, fine job he did, suppressing the uprising. And at its end, it also included a Bildbericht or image report that had 53 photographs. It's unclear who took these images. There are several theories about who might have taken them. But these images do have captions that give the boy in the Warsaw Ghetto, they give this famous photograph very different meanings than the ones that circulate today. In its original context, the image appeared among other images that were depicting Jews as subhuman and as worthy of extermination. Its original title was Forcibly Extracted from Bunkers. So those are the images before it. And then in the images that come after it, again, more images that characterize Jews as bandits and as dregs of humanity. In other words, these images were never intended as a kind of morality tale about the Holocaust in Jewish resistance, but in the afterlife of the Holocaust, they have taken on meanings. To return to this issue of secular icons, one of the really important ways that this image was launched into the public sphere and began to take on the meanings that it has today was that it was published in the New York Times on December 26, 1945, which I would note is the day after Christmas. Speaking of holidays in which, about children who died such that others might live. Although there are questions about whether the boy in the ghetto image died, but that's a different story. But the point is that this image has taken on a significance well beyond its meaning and taken on these kind of moral overtones. And meanwhile, outside of specialist circles, don't really know about the original context. And so, just by way of conclusion, which the Sonderkommando photographs, to remind you, were this set of photographs taken in August of 1944 that are some of, if not the only known photographs we have of this aspect of the Holocaust taking place as it was happening. These photographs are, in sort of traditional aesthetic terms, not very good photographs, like the ones that Christoph Kreutzmüller showed us of the ruins of the synagogue. Because of the conditions in which they were taken. They have these strange angles, illegible shapes, blurriness, and overexposure, and they don't have the kind of clarity and directness of the boy in the Warsaw Ghetto photographs. But again, that's because of the context in which they were taken. These photographs are frequently attributed to a Greek Jew known as Alex, who may or may not have, in fact, have been an officer in the Greek army named Alberto Herrera. The photographs show the incineration of the bodies of the gassed. The photographer used a camera that was smuggled into the camp, and he photographed from inside of a gas chamber to photograph surreptitiously. There is, of course, much more to say about Jewish resistance, and I hope we can discuss some of this in our questions and answers. But what I've tried to do in this quick comparison of two images, or really two sets of images, is to reiterate this really key point about Jewish resistance and iconic photographs, that they're more complicated than they seem. Iconic photographs simplify complex histories, and they help us remember the Holocaust, not necessarily as it was, but as we wish it had been.
Thank you, Professor Magalo. Everybody, you know that time runs. It does not wait for anyone, and it hasn't waited for us. And we are approaching very rapidly the end of our time for today's discussion. And so I am sure you, like I, feel completely frustrated, and I do apologize for that. I don't know how we lost time, but we did. I also just need to apologize. We've had a few technical issues with some of the the question and answers that you have been sending to us. We may not always have been able to actually open them, so I apologize for that. We will, however, just quickly look at some of the comments that have come through. And then what I would like to assure everybody is that you have our email address. You can send through to us questions. We will relay those to our panelists, and possibly we may have to have a part 2 to this conversation later down the year. But let's just quickly jump in. There was a question that wanted to know that was really about how the photographers got the film, the developing equipment, developing liquid and other equipment. And that is an example. I'm not going to say to answer it now. I'm just going to say that we see the question, and that is indeed grounds for an entire new discussion, because of course there were some photographers, it depended which photographers and where they were. So if you will remember at the beginning of our discussion, Ms. Strook spoke about Faye Schulman. Now, where did Faye manage to get her equipment? That is the kind of question that we will ask Ms. Strook at our next discussion to share with us. I wanted just to quickly look at the other question, which was, which is quite a challenging question, what was the real impact at the time? And again, this is a conversation that we will continue, but not today, because of course it again depended on who and when and how the photographs were taken and when they were released and where they were released. I want to just acknowledge an email from the son of Gideon Hausner, who is the prosecutor of the Eichmann trial. Amos Hausner, thank you very much for sharing with us your comment and thanking our panel. I agree with you. Most impressive and remarkable presentations. And now it really, I think, in a most unsatisfactory manner. And again, I do apologize that we haven't had longer with our panelists. But I think that what has been raised today is a question to make us, we'll go from end to front. Professor Magalo has asked us to look at those very familiar images, take a little bit longer to look at them, consider the captions, and if there are no captions, ask where the captions are, because what the original caption was, who took the photograph, really does matter in understanding better what this photograph is telling us about the history. Both Professor Magalo and Ms. Strook referenced the Sonderkommando photographs, and the connection was made there to the photograph of the synagogue, and one is reminded again never to forget the conditions under which these photographs were being taken and the courage it took to take those photographs. We have heard a little bit about Henrik Ross. We know, of course, there were other photographers in some of the other ghettos who also took photographs. We know much of what we know about the Holocaust because of the perpetrator photography. But as Professor Herbert pointed out to us, even within those perpetrator photographs, there is evidence of resistance. And I want us to just quickly go back to where we began with our colleague Ian Phillips, talking about, raised so many issues, reminding us again of the power of the image, and that it is the image that often stays much longer with us than the spoken word or the written word, because of course it doesn't require you to understand the written word. And so it is incumbent on all of us who work either as educators or as communicators when dealing with images to ask what is it that the image is telling us? What is it that the image is not telling us? How do we make sure that when the person receives that image, there is some context in which they can understand that image? And so, colleagues, I want to thank our panel on your behalf. I want to thank all of you for being with us for this very, very short hour. And I will hope that we will very soon again meet with you, reconvene for part 2. And thank you once again. Everybody keep safe, and we will be in touch. Thank you. Goodbye.